welcome back to class. Could I assume at this time that we have clear understanding what the product backlog is, which takes us to the next class on the sprint backlog. Of course, we have good knowledge. I assume that we have good knowledge of what the sprint backlog is, but we'll look at it from some other deeper angles. So back to the board for our demonstration. Again, when we get to practicals, for those who will be taking practicals, we'll look further at this, where you'll be able to create your own stories, you'll be able to demonstrate value, you'll be able to build your own specifications from stakeholders' brief. How it is on the job is that stakeholders would come and give you line of thought what they want. So it is for the team to now expand on that, to create specifications from those requirements, and now catalog them, ensuring that all angles are covered. All right, but in this class we're talking about the sprint backlog. I'm sure we all know at this point that the ones in Jira, and I make emphasis on that, on this pattern in Jira combines both product backlog and sprint backlog together on just one page, and that's the backlog. So the backlog, the one below, is the product backlog, and the ones above is the sprint backlog. So you could create as many sprints as you want. All you need to do is to come here and create sprints. When you click create sprints, it populates another sprint for you, where you now begin to load up. And of course, it's something you can edit. You can edit the sprints. You can customize the duration. This is where we spoke about the sprint duration being 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks. So you can customize, you can pick from the range a 1 week sprint, a 2 week sprint, and it would adjust the change date for you. Or you could also customize it, where you pick your own date. So we could decide to pick from the 29th and to another, or decide to make it a 2-weekly sprint, right? Then of course add your sprint goal. I made mention in the sprint planning class that each sprint should have a sprint goal, just one sprint goal, ideally, because the entire team is expected to be cross-functional, delivering just a piece of a value. That is what is expected ideally. But when you get to the field, when you get a job, you would realize that there could be different goals within a sprint. The product owner could see some ways to harmonize them, or however pattern it would work for you. It's agile, and agile is adaptive. Agile is flexible. So whatever works for the team is what you work on. But at least going into any sprint, there should be a sprint goal. So the sprint goal is what the team is driving towards. All right, so I'll cancel this out at this moment. So looking at the sprint, so we have the stories brought from the product backlog into the sprint. So because we've added sprint 1, we have approval and foundation. Sprint 2, we have foundation and block work. Sprint 3, we have block work also. So we could check after block work what will be next. So what I'm doing in some bits is what I explained in one of the previous classes, called backlog refinement or backlog grooming. So we could look after block work, what would come next. After we make the block, what do we do next? Is it the roofing? Okay, let's go to roofing. I hope I'm correct. Before plastering, because the roof needs to be in place before we plaster everything together. So let's deliberately pull from here to the sprint for. Let's assume this is a new sprint that we're going to. So we drop roofing there. Any other roofing, 2 other roofings. Roofing. Of course, I told us we can either click and drag or right click and push to wherever we want to push it to. Right? So that's roofing. Meaning, and we said in one of the last classes that we have a team total velocity of 10, meaning all the total stories we can work on per time is 10. Right? So we have 10 here, we have 4 here, we have 6 here, meaning this sprint 3 can actually accommodate all this to make up the total team velocity or the team capacity. Right? So this is the sprint backlog, where you have pieces of work items you want to deliver in a sprint. So we can see from here, this is the product backlog that has all the stories created. We then now, from this picture, 4 of it had now been selected into the sprint backlog. So this forms the product backlog, while this, let me get my marker. This forms the product backlog, while this forms the sprint backlog. Right? We've picked 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the same 4 from the product backlog, just as what I demonstrated in just for a few minutes, click and drag or select and right click. We have the same 4 here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But it goes further to break each story into tasks. So on this story, this same 1 story here that is 1 here, we have 3 tasks. 1, 2, 3. On this story, we have 3 tasks. 1, 2, 3. Don't mind me, this is not 7, it's 1. On this story here, we have 2 tasks. 1, 2. And on this story, we have 3 tasks. 1, 2, 3. That is breaking stories into tasks. And the same thing is what we have here. I think one of those stories from the timeline, let's check again, under approval as tasks. No, not you. Survey should be this. Yeah, it has 2 tasks here. Right? These 2 stories also would be estimated. I mentioned estimation in sprint planning, where we make use of planning poker, which is what we would use during the practicals. So we'll see how the story is broken down is picked from the product backlog into the sprint backlog and now decomposed further. Right? If you have any question on that, please note them down. So let's look at what the sprint backlog has to do with. Your work must be manageable workload. Ideally, according to Scrum, when a team has more than one moment, why is my slide jumping up and down? Let's look at this again. We mentioned that we have our team capacity is 10 story points, meaning we can only work on 10 total estimated points in a sprint. Where this team now has more work than what they can deliver on, we call it overcommitted. That means you have overcommitted stories in your sprint, and it's not a good practice. What you'll find on the field mostly is that some organizations or some teams just move all their stories from the product backlog and into one sprint. Boom. So they will do a piece of it, and at the end of the sprint, move everything again to the next sprint. Boom. And that's how they do it. But that is wrong. That is what we call anti-pattern in Scrum. Imagine you look at this board, and instead of seeing just few stories, you have 30 stories. How will you cope with it? So it shows that the board will be disorganized. The work will not be transparent enough. You will not be able to inspect adequately. And it could make developers to really hide behind what they're doing. Imagine when a developer is just working on one or two stories in a sprint. In actual sense, should be working on just one story per time. There's a let me step into Kanban a little. There's a process we call work in process limits. It's a practice in Kanban, which is used to restrict, and that is what is here actually on the board, maximum 2, meaning at any time you shouldn't have more than two stories here. What happens when it becomes 3? Let's see. 2 stories, right? While your maximum is 2, let's make it 3. It gets flagged. The stories still move, but it gets flagged that you have exceeded the maximum. So what this does is to help developers stay focused on the story they are working on per time. And that is good practice in Scrum. So as a Scrum Master, you need to guide your product owner, what I just described as anti-pattern, where all the stories are just moved from the product backlog, and it is overcommitted into the sprint backlog, is often done by the product owner. In one of the classes, I explained that most product owners on the field were converted project manager. They were mostly project manager. They ran through 3 days training, 2 days training, the product owner role, and they get converted. So they may not be deep in carrying out roles as a product owner according to Scrum. So a good Scrum Master needs to be there to guide and support the product owner to deliver value. So it is a bad practice for all the stories to move from the product backlog to the sprint backlog. The team should work on what they can deliver per sprint. So they should have manageable workload. Then, of course, I've explained that the sprint must have a goal. Then you must have your definition. It must meet definition of ready. Any story that does not meet definition of ready should not sprint. And that relates back to this, because when your team members have, let's say your team has a total of 10 hours to work, and you are accumulating the total tasks for 25 hours into 10 hours. That means they do not have the availability to finish that work. Such a story does not meet definition of ready. It doesn't matter how highly prioritized it is. When we go into the 4th module, under the Scrum Master role, we would be looking at a practice we call interrupt buffer. That is one of the ways you need to make adjustment to it. That does not that topic is not for the product owner, it's for the Scrum Master. Okay, but of course those who are taking both classes will be able to have both knowledge of that. So anything that does not meet definition of ready, including when a workload is too much, then it shouldn't come to your sprints. There's a practice in Lean Agile that talks about waste. Lean is about how you cut waste, and one of it is how you ensure that you are not overloaded, right? Also in the sprint, you match your capacity and availability. I've explained that also. Your capacity shows what the team has the technological know-how to deliver in that sprint. Where you want to dig, you want to make sock away in a sprint, and there are no laborers to dig, that means that team does not have the capacity to work on that. Same also is availability. Availability is available time to work on that story. And of course, during the sprint, for the sprint backlog, you should have a quick check on invest criteria. I've mentioned this earlier. Then of course, you need to identify the tasks to focus on within the sprints. So we could see how the sprint backlog closely relates with the sprint planning, because the sprint planning is a planning time at the commencement of the sprint. And what you do is to pick a few stories based on the team's capacity, availability, and meeting invest criteria into the sprint backlog, and now plan for that, what will be delivered in that particular sprint backlog. Why is this guy doing this? Okay. Then of course, you need to ensure that your backlog is adaptive. This is very important. This is very, very important. Adaptive in the sense that while you're also working, there could be bits of requirements, adjustments. I've said again and again in some of the classes that the product owner's role is the middleman between the stakeholders and the development team. So there could be reasons where something comes up in the course of the sprint that you need to adapt into your product backlog. When we get to practical, some of the practices, or rather some of the projects you'll be working on, will deliberately make adjustments to it in the course of the sprint, so that you could know how to adapt your stories, your work pattern, and deliveries even in the course of the sprint. Then I've explained also that work must be visible, and that is the essence of us having the board. Your board must be transparent enough where everybody knows what is happening per time. Every stakeholder that has access to the board could see progress of work in time, and of course, work needs to be transparent. All right, so that will be all for this class on the sprint backlog as the second artifact in Scrum. Thank you. We'll see next again, talking about the third artifact in Scrum, which is product increment. See you soon.